From MTN, the Montana Television Network, this is Face the State.
Good morning. I'm Dave Parker, MTN political analyst, and this is Face the State. As always, I'm joined with Chief Political Reporter Mike Dennison, and we're here basically to talk about elections. June 7th came and went on Tuesday. We had an election. We're almost at the end of the primary season. We just got D.C. left. Now, Mike, you've been covering politics in Montana for a long time. What was interesting that happened on Tuesday?
Well, there were three things I would point to first that kind of are a little surprising or notable. And the first thing was we look at the governor's race with Steve Bullock and Greg Gianforte easily winning their primaries, as we suspected. However, in the Republican primary, Gianforte won, was it 77, 76%, and the person running against him, Terry Nelson, who didn't campaign at all, he was the planner from Ravalli County, gets 22% of the vote. And to me, that indicates, or could indicate, and we're speculating here a little bit, has Gianforte nailed down his base yet? Maybe not. There are some people in the Republican Party, for whatever reason, voted against Gianforte, whereas you look at the Democratic side and Bullock, he won like 95, 94%, whatever it was. I would think that might be a concern for the Gianforte campaign. Again, I said we're speculating a little bit. We can't read the minds of voters. The second thing I know that was notable was the Supreme Court race, probably the most surprising thing. We have three candidates, Kristen Juris, Dirk Sandifer, a district judge in Great Falls, she's an attorney in Great Falls, and another attorney, Eric Mills of Great Falls, who spent not a single dime campaigning, ends up getting 22% of the vote. Sandifer, who has raised more money than Juris, he only gets 31, 32% of the vote, so he's got a lot of work to do. I'm not sure why that even happened. And the last thing, not really a surprise, just kind of a notable thing, we talked a lot about the legislative primary races in the Republican Party, the battle between the moderates and the conservatives. And the moderates basically held serve and actually gained a little bit of power, and I think they are going into the next legislature. They're still going to be a force, especially in the House. They have a couple more seats. Democrats could pick up seats there. There's going to be the same coalition of moderate Republicans and Democrats who are going to be driving the policy bus on some of these big issues.
And we're going to come back and revisit some of those issues, of course. Those are your surprises. And I was kind of sitting thinking, all right, what were kind of my big surprises? And the one thing I think that was somewhat surprising actually was the turnout. We had a turnout of 44.65%. That was a little behind 2008, but essentially we're talking about the second highest primary turnout since 1992.
Yeah, in 20 years.
20 years. And why I found that curious is in a lot of respects, there wasn't much of interest top ballot, right? I mean, I know the Sanders people are going to be upset at me saying this, but essentially that race has been wrapped up and the Trump race has been wrapped up. And if you go back to 2008, what you did have a legitimate contested race there all the way to the end between Obama and Clinton.
Absolutely, and they were campaigning like crazy here too. Both Clinton and Obama campaigned in 2008. A lot of presence in Montana, so that was a huge turnout then. But couldn't we say in this race that a lot of those ballots, 70% of them were cast absentee. So it could be a lot of those people were voting while things did still matter and it was still a race in those presidential primaries.
And that might have been the thing that happened. One of the things that we were trying to do is kind of figure out what is the turnout, in advance of Election Day. And one thing that we had anticipated is that, absentees would count for about, maybe 65, a top end 67%. And what happened is once all the ballots came in, 70% of the ballots that were cast were absentee. So that might have been a big reason. A lot of people just cast them in advance. But what's curious about this is, of course, only 30% cast their ballots on Election Day. And it looks like increasingly people are moving towards that mail ballot option. Is that a good thing?
Well, I'd like to see what it's going to look like for the general election, but I still think it's going to be at least 60% for the general election. I think Montanans are just kind of getting used to this idea that let's not have to go to the polls if I don't have to, so I'll vote early. And what does that mean? For campaigns, it means you basically have to start your campaign earlier and kind of campaign twice. And whether that's good or bad, I don't know.
It's one of the things where ease of access is definitely the bonus, and the theory is you can get more people voting, although we really haven't necessarily seen that. It's basically people who vote, they're just choosing the convenience. I personally am not a big fan of voting absentee for a variety of reasons, and I think a great example is this. You have a bunch of people on the ballot who may not actually be in the race anymore. That happened in Arizona. You had a bunch of presidential candidates, Republican side, drop out, and those votes were essentially wasted when they could have been perhaps moved to some other candidate. So I'm actually not a particularly big fan. But that was the one thing I definitely noted. The other thing that, of course, happened on Election Day is more ballots were cast on the GOP side than the Democratic side.
Exactly. That's one thing I want to talk about too and ask you about. I mean, what happens a lot, people look at that in the primary election and say, oh, more Republicans are voting. This is going to be a good thing for Republicans in the fall. But that's not the case, is it?
Yeah, so the first thing is Jeff Essman, of course, chair of the Republican Party, who's going to be joining us at the end of the month. He says, look, we got 500 more votes for Gianforte than Bullock, and as long as we pull that again in the fall, Gianforte will be our new governor. But what's interesting, and I actually looked at the numbers, it was 154,000, almost 155,000 GOP ballots cast versus 123. And I heard this line in 2012, I've heard it in the past. Yes, this means that people are more enthusiastic for Republicans, there's less enthusiasm for Democrats, but here's a number for you all. 2004, 110,000, almost 100, about 110,000 ballots were cast in the governor's race for the GOP, and 92,795 were cast for the Democrat. And of course, who became the governor in 2004?
Brian Schweitzer.
Brian Schweitzer.
Yeah.
So again, if you go back, that was also the case in 2012. More votes were cast on the Republican side of the ballot than the Democratic side, and Steve Bullock won the election. So what does this tell us? These are two different pods of voters. They're two different electorates. And you can't necessarily say what happened in the primary is indicative of all what's going to happen in the fall.
Well, we were looking at the numbers before the show. And in the fall, if we have a good turnout, we probably will because it is a presidential year, we're going to have more than 200,000 additional voters voting
right.
in the fall. And I guess my question to you is, who are these people? What do these voters have, or what are they thinking, what are they doing that the primary voters weren't?
Well, the first thing that happens is that primaries, we have there's a bunch of discussion about whether or not independents or Democrats should choose whatever ballot they want, or Republicans choose whatever ballot they want. But primaries are pretty much partisan affairs. So what it really says is that, yeah, there are more Republicans in Montana than Democrats. Well, we know that. Who are these voters? They tend to be lower information voters. They tend to be independents who tend to be less engaged in primaries. Or they tend to be leaners, like they're Democratic leaders or Republican leaners. They tend to be lower income voters. They tend to be, and this is not particularly the case here in Montana because we don't have a lot of minority voters, but they tend to be in other states minority voters. They tend to be basically people who find it more challenging to vote. For example, people who are less educated. Those are the voters that, when you have a richer information environment, far richer in a general election, that will turn out for those presidential elections. So the electorate's going to look different.
And the conventional wisdom is if we have a better turnout in a presidential year, which we always do in Montana, in a non-presidential year, it's usually around, in the 50s pretty much, or 50% or so.
A turnout in the general election could be 72%.
Well, in a presidential year, though.
In a presidential year, yes,
I'm
right.
saying a non-presidential year,
That's
it's much
right.
lower. So the conventional wisdom is that advantages Democrats when we have that higher turnout. Do you think that's the case in Montana? Will that be the case in Montana this fall?
Certainly it does advantage Democrats because the electorate tends to be more Democratic leaning, and it's in Montana, it's also nationally. And you see this in terms of the electorates have changed. Essentially, midterm electorates have become far more conservative, have become a lot whiter, whereas you tend to essentially have in the presidential elections an electorate which is much more disposed to vote for Democratic candidates.
Now, one thing we haven't talked about this morning is the results in the presidential primary from this week. Bernie Sanders, of course, wins Montana. Donald Trump wins Montana. But the nominees are going to be Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. And they'll be the top of the ticket in the fall. And my question to you is, what does that mean for candidates running in Montana, the down ticket candidates? Are they going to be affected by who's on the ballot at the top? Because if Steve Bullock is going to win as governor, I'm assuming that Donald Trump is going to be the person who's going to win the presidential race here in Montana. He's going to have to get people who vote for Donald Trump to then vote for him if he's going to win.
Yeah, so one of the if you kind of think about what the conventional political science wisdom is that, there are a lot of factors that suggest Hillary Clinton should win the election, but she's not going to win in Montana. So certainly Hillary Clinton has a lot of negatives going forward, for Democrats in the state. One is, obviously the Republicans are already hitting on the coal issue, saying, Hillary's going to be bad for coal and this is going to hurt coal strip. We've heard that right out of the gate. We've heard this in the primary.
Gun control.
Gun control, those are issues that do not play well. So certainly that's going to hurt candidates down ballot. The key thing is, have the candidates developed enough of a reputation to be independent-minded? But on the Republican side, man, Trump, every time he opens his mouth and says something bizarre, candidates, Republican candidates, are going to be asked, do you support this? Do you like this? What do you think about this? One major advantage the Democrats do have with Hillary Clinton, at least she's disciplined, whereas Donald Trump is not. So I can imagine that Gianforte and Zinke and all these other down ballot Republicans are constantly being asked about the stuff that Trump says. But on the other hand, conventional wisdom's been wrong in this election, and there's still a path for Trump to win the election, not just in Montana, but nationally.
Yeah, I think that is going to be kind of a wild card in this election. You mentioned that, as we know, Clinton has her baggage, but Trump has already shown that he can say things that could be damaging for other Republican candidates.
Generally speaking, what happens if the economy is strong, then the incumbent president's party is at advantage. But there's another weird thing called like an 8-year itch. Right, we've had 8 years of Obama. People want to change, so it's hard for the Democrats then to keep going. So that's another consideration as well. But then finally, typically what happens is that if you have a really ideologically extreme candidate versus a more moderate candidate, that tends to help the moderate candidate in the election. But the question is, who's a more extreme candidate? It's hard to tell in some respects. Is it Trump? Some of the things he says are extreme, but in other ways he's actually quite centrist.
Well, in that race, the presidential race in Montana, I think we know it's not really going to be close.
No.
I mean, the races that we're going to be watching are going to be
Yeah.
the governor's race is going to be the top race, certainly between Gianforte and Bullock, and we also have a libertarian in there as well. And then also the race that hasn't gotten any attention really at all yet, and that is Denise Juneau challenging Congressman Ryan Zinke. I think those will be the two top races, but I also think the Supreme Court race is going to probably attract a fair amount of money from outside groups, because we look at those results in the primary and we know it's going to be close.
Right. So the governor's race, going back to that, what does Gianforte need to do here on out to basically beat Steve Bullock?
That's a very good question. I watched him on primary night, and he said, he basically said his script. He's been saying that I'm the business guy, I'm for creating more jobs. I think what he has to do is, number one, he has to say, here's how I'm going to create jobs. He has to tell people how he's going to accomplish what he says he's going to accomplish. And he also has to assure Montanans that he's one of them, because the Bullock campaign is going to continue to try to paint him as an outsider, even though he's been here for 20 years and started a business that employed hundreds of people and brought all kinds of development and money to Bozeman. He still has to convince people that he's a Montanan. And I think that's going to be difficult. He has an Italian name. A lot of people out there, I still run into people all the time who they don't follow politics that closely, but they do follow it, and they say, who is this guy? Who's this Gianforte guy? And I tell them about what he's done, and they're impressed, but there's still that vast reservoir of non-knowledge about him as a candidate.
It could be that the 24% of the vote that Nelson got was simply like, I don't know this Gianforte fellow, I know a Nelson, I'm going to vote for a Nelson. It could be that. But what's interesting is I actually went down and looked at various counties to see what the percentage of vote that Nelson was. Here in Gallatin County, where theoretically Gianforte should be the most known, Nelson got 17% of the vote. And so it's hard to know what that vote means, but it's clear that there are some voters out there that either don't know him or maybe for some reason or other don't like Gianforte, and that they have to narrow down that base. They've got to nail down that base before going into the fall. That's clear. Now, what's interesting, going over to Phillips County, where Leslie Robinson's from, only 8% voted for Nelson there. So the reason I think that's important, and one of the first things that was said after the election night is that to rural Montana, that help is on the way by Leslie Robinson. This was said. And what I think this is a very clear strategy that the Gianforte campaign have to do is drive up rural vote percentages, because the urban areas, which had relatively low turnout here in the primaries, are going to come out heavier and theoretically more for the Democratic vote. And in fact, this is exactly the playbook that Scott Walker pulled in Wisconsin to win the governorship in 2010. But here's the problem. the electorates, again, are different. 2010 electorate tends to be more conservative, more rural, whereas you got a presidential election year, it's going to be more urban. So it's interesting to see this strategy, but definitely see they've been visiting rural areas, and I think it's to drive up that vote in order to basically try to beat Bullock.
Well, I think that I think they've already got that rural vote. I think they may want to drive the turnout up, but if I were Gianforte, I'd be saying I have to limit the damage in these urban areas and do well in urban areas that are friendly, such as Kalispell and maybe Billings and maybe even Bozeman to some extent. I would ask you the same question you asked me about Bullock. What does he have to do to win re-election? Because so far what we've seen him doing is playing it pretty safe, not really coming out with any sort of initiative. What do you think he has to do to win a race which he probably should win?
Well, the first thing is his approval ratings are still pretty high. And the second of all, the economy is pretty good. So to some extent, a lot of this is just about fundamentals. And as the person sitting in the office, if as long as those two things stay good, then all he needs to do is basically tout those accomplishments and go out there. The other thing is I think he can't take Gianforte for granted. One might argue that Gianforte is a first-time candidate as an amateur running for office. That you could say, well, he's not going to do a very good job. He's not a very serious candidate. And if that's the thinking of the Bullock people, and I don't think it is, then that's a big mistake. They should basically be very aggressive constantly against everything that Gianforte says, and come back with an answer. So I would be very aggressive against Gianforte. And in fact, I think this campaign is going to get pretty gosh darn negative. I think it's already started that way. I think it's going to get worse. A lot of people get turned off by that, but that's actually a good sign of a good competitive race.
Now, we've talked a lot about the governor's race, which is the top race in the state, but what I think is probably just as important is the race for the legislature. I mean, these are the guys that set policy along with the governor, and that's going to be key. Right now we have a legislature that's controlled by Republicans. I don't think there's any doubt that they're still going to control it after this next election, but the dynamic's going to change. How is it going to change, and where should we be looking to see what may be the key races across the state in terms of who controls it?
What's great is that we had these wonderful primary races on the Republican side, but as we talked about on election night, where those primary races were contested, those races are not of interest for the fall because they're pretty much in the largely heavily Republican districts.
Just about all of them, yes.
Just about all of them. And the thing that you noted, right, you told me that the Democrats made some inroads in one of the chambers and they lost a seat in another chamber already. Could you explain that?
Yes, in the House, there's a seat up in Rocky Boy, which is held by Bruce Myers, a Republican. It's an Indian district primarily. Bruce is an Indian, and that was kind of an extraordinary win he had 2 years ago. Now he's running for a Senate seat, so that is an open seat, and no Republican has filed. So the Democrats already have a pickup. We start out with 58-42 split in the House. And then over in the Senate, it's 29-21 Republicans right now, but I think you can almost say it's basically 30-20 because there's one district, Senate District 15, right in the middle of the state, Lewistown, that area there, is held by Brad Hamlet, a Democrat from Cascade County. He was assigned that seat in redistricting, and now he's out. He's running for the House, by the way, in Great Falls. So that district will certainly go Republican. It's a Republican district. So we start out basically GOP up one in the Senate, Democrats up one in the House.
The first thing I want to say globally is if you go back to 2014, horrible year for Democrats nationally, bad year for Democrats in Montana, and yet the Democrats managed to squeeze out 2 seats in the House. Now, we're going to an environment in a presidential election year where the fundamentals are better for Democrats. So one would expect that Democrats should be better this time around. You're looking at the Senate, man, 30-20. Do the Democrats have any prospects of gaining seats in the Senate? And looking from my seat, the problem is, from both the Republican side and the Democratic side, is that most of these seats are overwhelmingly Democratic or overwhelmingly Republican. So there's very few marginal seats. Where are the seats of interest? I see 2.
Yeah, there basically are 2 seats. One is in Billings, Senate District 26, an open seat held by Republican Elsie Arntzen, who's running for Superintendent of Public Instruction. We have Margie McDonald, who is a Democratic representative from Billings, who's been around quite a while, so she's got plenty of name recognition. She's running against Don Roberts, who used to be in the legislature. That's going to be a good race. It'll be close. That's probably the only chance for a Democratic pickup that I see. The other race of note is over in the Helena area, Senate District 40. That's held by a Democrat, Christine Kaufman. It's a redistricted seat. And now it goes from West Helena all the way up to Ovando, Lincoln, up almost into the Sealy-Swan Valley. So it's kind of a rural district with some urban part. But I think it will be a good race. We have Hal Jacobson, a Democrat from Helena, who used to be in the legislature, against the Republican, Terry Gauthier, owns businesses in Helena. He owns the McDonald's restaurants in the Helena area. That's going to be a good race. I think it'll be fairly close. I would probably give the advantage to the Republican just because of the rural nature of the district, but we'll see.
So I actually look at these two seats, and again, one of the things I look at is the quality of the candidate, the ability to fundraise, and you look at that seat. Both have raised about $15,000.
Senate District 40 you're talking about?
Yeah, Senate District 40. The problem here for the Democrats is that one of the other things you look at is what was the presidential vote in the district. That gives you an idea of the underlying partisan nature of the district. 41% Obama. In many respects, that's a seat that a Democrat should not be holding. So that seems to be almost like a very flippable seat. Their best chance, we talked about, Elsie Arnson's seat, that Senate District 26 in Billings, that's probably their best shot of a pickup. But even then, Obama only got 44% of the vote there. So there's a possibility of either a wash or, I mean, you might even argue a Democratic loss in the Senate going forward.
Yeah, I think Democrats would be fortunate to keep it at 30-20. I think the best they can hope for is to keep it at its current 29-21. And they do that by winning that seat in Billings and winning Senate District 40 as well. So it's going to be pretty much the same there in the Senate.
You go over to the House, though, that is where the action is. There's
Absolutely.
a lot of seats in play. That's the first thing. And talking about, so they're up 8 now with what happened on election night. There's a pathway to 6 pickups for them, but of course that also assumes that they're going to hold some vulnerable Democratic seats. So let's talk about some of these seats that we find of interest.
Yes, in the House, like you said, 6. I think it's more likely that Democrats may pick up 2, 3, maybe 4. But the ones we're looking at, Livingston, House District 60, Deborah Lamb is the Republican incumbent. That's often been a Democratic seat. That's going to be a very good race. Also, we look up in Havre, House District 28, Stephanie Hess is the Republican. Havre traditionally has been Democratic, thought as Democratic, but Democrats have not won in Havre for 2 or 3 or 4 elections. And we'll see how she does, holding serve in her race. But one thing I would note here, that we learned in the primary, how difficult it is to beat an incumbent. Only 2 incumbents lost throughout the state in the primary election. Randy Pinocchi up in Great Falls, Art Whittick here in Bozeman. Art Whittick had months of negative headlines against him because of his case involving the campaign finance violations.
And theoretically, he probably didn't have much time to campaign, I'm guessing.
And he only lost by 100 votes. And then up in Great Falls, Pinocchi, who was not a very well-liked guy, and he was defeated by another incumbent, Wendy McCamey, who has a big family, lots of name recognition in Great Falls. And so those are the only 2 incumbents that lost. And I just think that incumbents go into these races with huge advantages because in legislative races, most voters don't really know the candidates that well. They don't read about them in the paper very much. And so we can talk about these people who are vulnerable, but it's still going to be tough to beat them.
So in fact, actually go back to 2014 cycle, there were only 2 incumbents that lost in those legislative races as well. One of them actually, Pinocchi beat an incumbent Republican in the primary, and of course he loses in the primary. But you're right, very, very hard to beat incumbents, and that's why Stephanie has an advantage. And in fact, actually with the fundraising numbers right now, she's almost has twice the amount of money as her opponent going into the fall. You mentioned the Lamb seat, Deborah Lamb's seat over in House District 60 in Park County. Actually, I think she's probably the most vulnerable Republican in the House, and here's why. You look at the fundamentals of that seat, it's a 51% Obama seat. That's a seat that really, and by the way, I looked at the vote shares here, and it looks like Bernie Sanders, that was the best county that he had in the entire state. So those 2 factors combined, I think Deborah Lamb is in trouble. Lori Bishop's raised almost twice as much money as Deborah Lamb.
And it'll be a bigger turnout this year, so that is advantage Democrat. And a couple other seats we didn't mention in the House, also up in Great Falls, House District 23, that was McCamey's seat, the person who beat Pinocchi. She abandoned that seat. That's pretty much a Democratic seat. I think they're going to win that. It's right in the center of Great Falls, a Democratic city, so I think that's probably a Democratic win, and they have a former state senator running on that district as well. The other one is House District 92, which stretches from Missoula up the Blackfoot Valley up into the Sealy-Swan.
It's like the eastern part of Missoula County.
And that's an open seat, and the conservative Republican won the primary. He's running against a fairly moderate Democrat, Adrian Marks, who is from Sealy Swan and has raised a lot of money. I think that's going to be a very competitive race.
He's raised almost $16,000, which is a lot of money for a seat. Also, House District 93, which is up in that area. Again, that's an open seat. That's another possible, and it tends to be, it's a Democratic, leans Democratic, and that seat also is a possible pickup.
Yeah, it has been up there on the part of the Flathead Indian Reservation. Also, but there are some Democrats, as you mentioned, who are not shoo-ins for re-election in the House races. We have Zach Perry up in Columbia Falls, who won a very tight race in kind of a conservative area 2 years ago. And also in Helena, we have Marianne Dunwell, who won a razor-sharp victory over Steve Gibson, a moderate Republican from East Helena 2 years ago. They're running against each other once again, although there is a Libertarian in that race too, so that could
the two seats that I would be most worried about as a Democrat, one is Zach Perry. I talked to a local up there, former actually state representative Mike Jopek, and he says Perry's a hard worker. He's very engaged in a lot of the redevelopment there. But that seat, I mean, talk about a difficult seat to defend. 37% Obama, so a very Republican seat.
Yeah.
But he's challenged by Taylor Rose, the Southern Poverty Law Center says is essentially a white supremacist. So I don't know how that's all going to play in the fall. But Zach Perry definitely has a challenge. But the one incumbent that you mentioned, Mary Ann Dunwell, I actually think more troubling for the Democrats is Jessica Kurjala, House District 48. She is in a seat that Obama got 47.8% of the vote, running against a guy named Rob Saunders, who's raised $27,000.
Well, a lot of it's his own money, though. So
what's interesting about that, and its cautionary tale, is that self-funded candidates definitely have challenges. And this is actually a note of caution for anyone that's basically just put their own money into a race, is that one of the important things that you have to do as a candidate is raise money and meet people and get support. And if you're not doing that, that's problematic. So that's perhaps the saving grace. While he has a lot of money, he hasn't actually probably made a lot of those networking connections in the community within the party.
Well, and also Kurjala, I believe, has a reputation as a good campaigner. I mean, she took out an incumbent 2 years ago. So, she knows how to do it, and now she's defending her incumbency. But it is a swing district, so that's going to be a good battle to watch.
One other seat that we're paying attention to is House District 51. That's
Billings.
That's downtown Billings, isn't it? Or
yeah, it's in the central part of town.
Yeah.
And it had been held by Margie McDonald, who's a longtime Democratic state representative. She is running for that Senate seat we were just talking about. So it's an open seat. Democrats have a pretty good candidate, but it's going to be a tight race. She barely won last time. In fact, the person she ran against, I believe, was Tony O'Donnell, the person who ended up beating Kirk Bushman for the Public Service Commission seat in Southeast Montana in the primary, and therefore is the next commissioner because there is no Republican in that district.
So we have lots of interesting seats to pay attention to for the legislature, mostly in the House. Certainly a strong battle that's going on there. We still have lots of things that we haven't talked about. We have the Supreme Court race, where we had, basically Dirk Sandefur's raised a lot of money. I should also just say real quickly that Juris actually raised and spent about $70,000, which is actually more than I thought. But we have lots to talk about. We could do that again. What we're going to be doing on the next show is talking about the Affordable Care Act, known as Obamacare, having a discussion about what works, what doesn't work. We'll see you again frankly, next week. Thanks, and this is Face the State.
You've been watching Face the State, a presentation of MTN, the Montana Television Network.